Buenas tardes. Antes de todo, quiero agradecer a los colegas de México, Pablo Avilés y Manuel Suárez, y por dos razones. Primero, por su invitación a hablar, para hablar, y también por la traducción de mi texto en inglés que pueden leer en los subtítulos. Ahora voy a comenzar con un documento extraordinario producido por una mujer inglesa hace más de 100 años. So now in English. In 1900 or thereabouts, Lorena Bulwer, an inmate of the Great Yarmouth Workhouse in the east of England, produced a remarkable and extremely long letter. It was embroidered on samples of different kinds of material, which she had sewn together to form a scroll of multicolored cloth. And I'm going to try to show you now what it looks like. And in more detail, on her sampler scroll, Lorena stitched this rambling autobiography in which she spat out her anger at being confined to the workhouse and more specifically to its female lunatic ward. She asserted her identity frequently, repeated her name many times, and declared that she was free. Lorena Bulwer's sampler reminds us of the importance of writing at all levels of society for both intimate and public purposes, as well as in the process of identity formation. It also demonstrates that writing is ubiquitous and often uses unexpected materials and unorthodox technologies. People of modest social origins have always left written traces of their otherwise obscure existences. And French anthropologist Daniel Fabre usefully labeled texts like this ordinary writings, and they form the subject of what I'm going to talk about today. So writings like the writings of Lorena enable us to rescue forgotten lives from anonymity and give them some shape and substance. Lorena's scroll is material for the historian of scribal culture or written culture. I use the phrases interchangeably. And I'd like to draw your attention today to this kind of history from below. And I hope to give you a clearer idea of the broad scope and concerns of the history of written culture, with particular reference to the common writer. This belongs to a new history from below, which attempts to give voice and agency to members of the subordinate classes. So whether we consider ego documents, life writings of various kinds, correspondence, graffiti in streets or in prisons, we place value on the subjective experience of the individual in a given historical environment. Considering the past from the point of view of non-elites opens up the possibility of an alternative history which contrasts with conventional top-down political narratives. It changes the perspective, focusing on the assumptions and the concerns of the so-called silent masses and finding them to have been not quite so silent after all. It provides an insight into the cultural universe of the poor, the mental world of the soldier, and the personal struggles of the young emigrant or pauper. The aim, according to one Italian historian, is, I quote, to give a voice, a personal identity, a subjectivity, a presence, and dignity back to the ordinary protagonists of history. In practice, whenever historians invest value in ordinary lives, they invariably discover that the individuals they're studying are not quite so ordinary after all. So the new history from below is making great efforts to unearth more direct evidence of the writings of the poor and the marginal, the writings of people who in the past have not always been credited with the ability to write at all. Common writers can only be fully understood if we listen to their own voices, however inarticulate they may seem, and regard them as active agents in their own history rather than passive receptacles for official ideologies. Our world, according to French historian Arlette Farge, has been inhabited by so many invisible beings who remain isolated in their poverty or else swallowed up by wars or powerful waves of migration, and that historians are now obliged to treat them as living, feeling subjects. So in his landmark study, The English Common Reader, published in 1957, Richard Altick maps out the new historical field of working class reading in Britain for the first time. And his pioneering work led in direct descent to scholarly masterpieces on British working class autodidacts by David Vincent and Jonathan Rose. So by entitling this talk, The Common Writer, I'm paying indirect and implicit homage to Altick's initiative. But the history of the book, together with its offspring, the history of reading, has tended to marginalize the history of writing practices. The world of print usually dominates scholarly study to the extent that it eclipses the rich and varied world of manuscript culture. At some point, the history of writing seems to have drifted free from book studies and from the history of reading, like a melting ice floe, until the new literacy studies invited us to fit these disparate pieces of the jigsaw back together again. For scholars of the new literacy studies, the different ways in which we engage with written culture, or literary culture in general, I should say, from reading a newspaper to writing a personal letter, can all be categorized as literacy events, elements of vernacular, everyday forms of literacy, whether they involve reading, writing, or a combination of both. The study of ego documents, for instance, shows us that the history of reading is deeply entwined with the history of writing practices. It would be misleading to give the impression that the history of written culture came into being just as a poor relation of its elder sibling, the history of reading. In practice, many different disciplines come together under its banner. Archaeologists and anthropologists have worked in the history of writing for decades, pursuing their own distinctive priorities. Their fieldwork has been the basis for an exploration of the complex relationships between the oral and the written, which has illuminated literacy practices in ancient societies, as well as in more modern contexts in Africa, South America, the Asia-Pacific region. We can equally turn the lens inwards to explore literacy and orality amongst the white tribes of the Western world, just as the British Mass Observation Project did, established in 1937. It attempted to construct what it called an ethnography of ourselves. Paleographers, in their turn, help us decipher ancient and medieval manuscripts and explain the history of handwriting systems. Specialists in literary studies have a long-standing interest in autobiographical writing, which they have now broadened to embrace non-canonical and sometimes inexpert writers. And in the Nordic countries, the key discipline of folklore studies has played an important role in the study of peasant writings. So historical sociolinguists have recently also grasped the potential of ordinary writings to provide valuable insights into language change. And cultural historians like me are just one of several travelers on this motley caravan of scholars. But where does the history of written culture stand, and what does it stand for? Its scope is broad in terms of writing genres. It includes life writing of different sorts, including the autobiographies of criminals, narratives of religious conversion or of political engagement, as well as extraordinary creations like the enormous typescript produced by the Sicilian peasant and road mender Vincenzo Rabbito. Rabbito, born in 1899, had no formal schooling. He produced over 1,000 pages of autobiography, typed on an old Olivetti, incorporating standard Italian and Sicilian dialect. Every word of his text was separated from the next by a semicolon. That's what it looks like. Works like this autobiography by Rabbito are not literary autobiographies, but they represent the life experiences of ordinary and sometimes marginal people. Correspondence is another genre which is a focus of the history of written culture, including letters from soldiers, prisoners, emigrants, and poor people seeking welfare benefits. The exchange of letters is one genre of ordinary writings which inevitably brings together the study of both literacies, reading and writing. We can also include the genre of what I call writing upwards, in which employers, subjects, and citizens petitioned their boss or their political leader. Manuscript culture is a phenomenon which is often considered in relation to print, but much less often treated in its own right, which is what I'm recommending. Graffiti and handwritten newspapers are further topics for scholarly historical study. Writing on walls, Antonio Castillo Gomez has written, may be the most prevalent form of writing in history, but its existence is often ephemeral and the historian has difficulty in attributing authorship. The graffiti of the inquisitorial prisons of the Spanish Empire, which archaeologists are nowadays eager to preserve, represent cries of survival, holy images, prayers, and poems, one-sided written conversations which broke the solitude and isolation of incarceration. Whatever the writing genre under discussion, we seek to understand the importance of writing and the reasons why, in given historical situations, people chose this medium to protest, communicate, or demand a favor from a superior. Written texts are not simply evidence of something beyond themselves, as when a soldier's letter home from the front gives us information about the morale of the army, for example. Writing can be examined for what it says about itself, its purpose and function, its social grammar, its norms of composition, the materials and the technology which enable it to happen and at the same time define its possibilities. Some writers familiar with the act of writing formed their characters evenly and accurately. They had mastered the use of margins and blank spaces on the page. Others, for whom writing was a rare activity, experienced difficulty in holding a straight line and following the conventions of epistolary literacy concerning margins, indentation, spelling, and grammar. In Parma, Italy, in 1870, Eufrosina Serventi congratulated her fiancé Pietro on his writing skill, telling him in one of her letters that your writing looks like it's printed. Mine, on the other hand, really looks like chicken feet. She knew she could not match Pietro's greater facility and accuracy with the pen, but chicken feet or not, she commands as much of our attention as her more polished lover. And here she gave us a good example, actually, of the ways in which correspondence often contains a meta-language in which writers reflect on their own practices and expectations of each other. Letters, in other words, speak about themselves. One way in which historians of scribal culture collectively assert their disciplinary identity is in recognizing common ancestors. A few notable scholars provide a common intellectual heritage and help us to define the historical study of writing practices. And I just want to mention here the foremost of those, and that was Armando Petrucci in his published work on epistolary culture, manuscript culture, public inscriptions, and monuments to the dead, mainly in the period stretching in Europe from late antiquity to the Renaissance. Petrucci argued that writing, along with the social distribution of writing skills, gave us an indispensable key to unlock the workings of any given society. The uses of writing lay bare the inequalities and power structure on which past societies rested. According to Petrucci, every age and every society can be better understood and appreciated through studying the uses it makes of writing as an instrument, the ways in which writing and reading competence is distributed throughout society, and the functions that it attributes to scribal production and its various typologies. Petrucci's statement could stand as a foundation text for the history of writing culture. He did more than anyone, I think, to bridge the gap between the erudite examination of manuscripts on the one hand and the broader concerns of the socio-cultural historian on the other. My own work is indebted as well to the ethnologist Daniel Fabre, who coined the phrase ordinary writings in his studies of the uses of writing in the rural southwest of France. The phrase has several dimensions here. On one level, it refers to a range of non-literary writings, the kind of personal and often ephemeral texts that we rely on to organize our lives, like household budget, shopping lists, reminders of all sorts. These are vernacular and ordinary writings, the kind which the sociologist Bernard Lahire called domestic writings, and the mass observation project, which I mentioned before, calls hidden or invisible writings. Ordinary writings, though, has another meaning. It refers to the authors themselves and their modest social origins. I understand the phrase principally from this angle, denoting the textual practices of subordinate classes and marginalized groups. The focus in what follows is going to be on the everyday cultural practices and self-representation of people of low social status and perhaps imperfect literary competence. Until recently, the history of popular, by which I mean lower class writing, has revolved around a handful of well-known but exceptional cases, frequently cited for their extraordinary achievements. Angela Veronese, a gardener's daughter born near Treviso in the northeast of Italy in 1779, is one of them. Because she wrote an autobiography, we are well informed about her early reading of romances, fables, and lives of the saints. We discover here peasants reading Tasso and Ariosto aloud on winter evenings, since she herself joined them. We know of her keen desire to read and later to write, although her education was typically piecemeal, and she concealed her youthful writing from her disapproving parents. Another well-known case is Clelia Marchi, a much more recent one, having written her autobiography on a double bedsheet, a matrimoniale, after the death of her husband in 1972. She then experienced an emotional crisis, but in writing, she found a new reason to live. One night, she said, I had no more paper left. My teacher, Angelina Martini, had explained to me that the Etruscans had wrapped up a dead body in a piece of cloth with writing on it. I thought that if they did that, I can do it too. I couldn't wear out the sheets with my husband anymore, and so I thought of putting them to use for writing. She apologized for her poor handwriting, her lack of formal education. Her writing was improvised. It included elements of local dialect. Her grammar and spelling were not always correct. But her Libro Lenzuolo, her sheet book, is preserved today in the Archivio Diaristico Nazionale in Pieve Santo Stefano, where it's exhibited once a year, like the ostension of a holy relic. And I hope you can just make it out hanging up in the background in this not very sharp image. The wartime autobiography of Louis Barthas, who was a cooper from the Aude department in southwestern France, has become another emblematic case of popular writing. Barthas was an insubordinate soldier. His writing reflected his regional loyalties and Occitan roots, all reasons why French scholars might be specially interested in him. Most importantly, the publication of his autobiography in 1978 balanced historians' customary reliance on the war memoirs of well-educated and highly articulate army officers and started a trend to expand the common stock of reference texts to include the writings and experiences of ordinary soldiers. And one more candidate here is the Barcelona tanner Miquel Parets, born 1610, who wrote a much-cited historical chronicle with an eyewitness account of the plague of 1651. Parets copied official documents into his account, including the entire text of the Treaty of the Pyrenees between Spain and France in 1659. His anonymous translator compared Parets to the mythical Icarus, who had flown too near the sun, burned his wings, and fallen to earth. He was an over-adventurous writer with ambitions beyond his proper station. The point I want to make here is that behind these individual stars, who all undoubtedly deserve their place in the limelight, there lie hundreds of thousands, and if not millions, of other ordinary writers whose existence remains shadowy and whose engagement with the written word is rarely appreciated. The astronomical statistics of postal items sent from the France during the First World War suggest the writing bulimia, which swept through Europe's peasant armies in the trenches. Four million items issued daily from the French army in 1915. The Italian army produced 4,000 million items in 3.5 years of war, in spite of the fact that 35% of Italians were officially illiterate on the eve of the conflict. And Germany produced at least 30,000 million items. For many, the act of writing was unfamiliar and laborious, but absolutely essential to keep in contact with families and let them know that one was still alive. Laurent Pouchet, a 30-year-old wine grower from the Hérault in southwestern France, forced himself into the writing habit. He wrote home in 1915, looking forward to the day when on pourra finir toutes ces comédies d'écriture. Cela sera une joie, un bonheur pour nous. We will be able to finish with all this writing farce. So writing was often a chore, and drafting a letter required the help, perhaps, of a friendly comrade, but it had become an absolute daily necessity for millions of untutored correspondents like Pouchet. Historians are accustomed to interrogating soldiers' correspondence about their experience of warfare, and more recently in France, about the degree to which they were patriotically committed or not to fighting for their country in 1914, 1918. Historians of scribal culture are in search of additional information from this outpouring of popular writing. They see it as evidence of literacy and of writing practices, as an indication of the purpose and function of writing itself. Many peasant writers, after all, wrote very little at the time about their combat experience, and an unprepared reader may be surprised by the laconic tone of their letters and the banalities that filled them. But their laconism and their banality are significant. The main purpose of writing home from the trenches for them was consolatory, to reassure parents and loved ones that everything was all right, no matter how horrific the reality of soldiers' lives may have been. The primary function of the soldier's letter was to show that he was still alive. The content of what he wrote was incidental to this fundamental message. The age of mass transoceanic migrations generated another enormous corpus of letter writing from below. Emigrants' letters can be very productively mined for information about the experience of emigration itself and about the process by which men and women who began life in a new country gradually acquired a double identity. They provide an alternative to the economic history of mass migration, inviting us to see emigrants not simply as a mass of anonymous particles magnetized by push and pull factors, but as individual agents determining their own future, usually as part of an overall family strategy for survival. Here too, studying letter writing from below has the effect of giving a voice to individuals who are otherwise subsumed within a global mass of labor market statistics. But as with soldiers' letters from the front, emigrants' letters can tell us more if we pause our data mining for a moment and consider them as letters per se. They are precious documents about the practice of writing itself, about the rules and the tacit conventions governing all epistolary exchanges, about the history of language usage, and about the importance of literacy to the writers. For Spanish and Italian emigrants to the Americas, literacy was of vital importance, not just for gaining employment in warehouses, shops, and small businesses, but also for maintaining contact with their families and the social networks from which they had uprooted themselves. Many of them left Spain as no more than teenage boys, with a very incomplete grasp of how to read and write. And nothing illustrates better the value that they placed on literacy than the investment that successful migrants made in the local schools of their province of origin. They were determined that the next generation of emigrants would be better equipped than they had been. So whether the focus is on letters, autobiographies, graffiti, or other genres, the new history from below is potentially a political project. The writings of ordinary people form the material for a counter-history, and several 19th century British worker autobiographers intended that their own writing should serve exactly that subversive purpose. No one else they knew would provide the kind of working class history they wanted to leave behind them. And a few of them were well aware that no adequate history of the radical Chartist movement in England and Scotland and Wales had appeared in their lifetimes. William Adams, son of a plasterer, a former Chartist and Republican, set out to put the record straight. It is extremely unlikely, he wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, that any competent and satisfactory narrative of a stupendous national crisis, he meant Chartism, will ever now be given to the world. But his account, he promised, will relate the commonplace experiences of a humble worker in a humble sphere of life. Radicals like Adams wanted to balance the public record, giving their own version of their role in British radicalism. At their best, they offered a kind of alternative political history of the 19th century. The successors of those radical working class writers can be found amongst the correspondents of the Mass Observation Project, based at the University of Sussex, and they were invited at regular intervals to write their observations of British daily life. Their written observations contributed, as they themselves saw it, to an alternative history of the 1980s and 1990s, which would balance and rectify versions published by the rich and powerful, and which would contradict the distortions and stereotypes peddled by the mass media. One 53-year-old male contributor invited in 1991 to reflect on his own written efforts for the Mass Observation Project, participated in this democratic writing enterprise with enthusiasm in the following words. The words of the peasants of the Middle Ages are lost to us, swallowed up in the silence of an enforced illiteracy. What did they think when they trooped in for Mass under the censorious eyes of a fat priest, or burned a greedy lord's castle? I remember the faintly opprobrious label, History from Below, was placed on the kind of work Sussex University was instrumental in making happen. Fucking right on, I'd say. I'd rather have that sort of history than history written by eminent arse-lickers, honors junkies, and apologists for state crimes. Whatever the genre, the new History from Below aims to make visible the writings of ordinary people, neglected and disqualified by a dominant culture, but capable of enriching our understanding of the many meanings of literacy. Can the subaltern speak? Asked Gayatri Spivak in an essay now celebrated in post-colonial studies. Even if subalterns could speak, they were likely to remain subalterns until they could also write. So what common characteristics do these various genres of ordinary writings share? I just want to briefly define 7 elements which are usually present. Firstly, they're normally written by authors of modest social origins. In the European context, this leads us into the cultural world of peasants, artisans, and workers. Historians of ordinary writings have usually been vague about the sociology of the authors they study. To some extent, that's been a deliberate strategy in order to allow for some social mobility, as peasants become teachers, artisans become merchants, and so on. So we don't want too rigid a classification. It can create more problems than it appears to solve. Secondly, common writers write in unorthodox genres, not merely diaries and autobiographies, which follow recognizable literary models, but also songbooks, recipe books, historical chronicles, homemade encyclopedias, hymn books, sketchbooks, and combinations of all of these. And now I'm just going to show you a songbook of an Italian soldier, which is also a sketchbook and which also contains all sorts of different kinds of writing. Originating in 13th century Italy, the Libri di Ricordanze recorded family genealogies, baptisms, marriages, and deaths, as well as historical chronicles, in which the authors recorded major events, especially disasters like great floods and earthquakes. Peasants listed harvest yields and each year wrote down a summary of income and expenses. The memory books, to give a generic title to a phenomenon which had several labels, were a hybrid genre, part history, part genealogy, part business accounts. They don't fit any canonical literary genre, and they constitute a distinct form of writing. Common writers are not literary writers. They use their own vernacular style, and their literacy practices are rooted in everyday life. Furthermore, the materials they use may be improvised, as in the case of Lorena Bulwer and her scroll with which I started this talk. Spanish emigrants wrote home on pages torn from accounting ledgers after a long day of work. Soldiers in the trenches scribbled postcards home by the light of a lantern dangling from a bayonet. They appropriated whatever was available to satisfy their urgent need to write. When Australian Aboriginal peoples petitioned their government, they presented their request as traditional bark paintings in a proud statement about the independence and longevity of their culture. And I'm showing you an image of some well-known bark petitions in which the text, which is bilingual in Aboriginal language and also in English, is surrounded by traditional Aboriginal bark illustrations. So the material aspects of writing from below are sometimes unexpected, but frequently significant. If common writers had received only a partial and interrupted formal education, they did not always apply all the standard protocols of grammar and orthography. Their letters were devoid of punctuation. Their sentences ran into each other without a break. Their capitalization was inconsistent. Their grammar and spelling tended to follow spoken usage rather than standard written practice. Common writers' word separation was random, as sometimes they combined several words together into one, hyposegmentation, and at other times went to the opposite extreme, dissecting words into neatly autonomous syllables, hypersegmentation. Ordinary writings are distinguished by the presence of orality and gesture in the text. Just as the spelling and punctuation of common writers was inconsistent, so too were their lexical choices and their use of language in general. One consistent characteristic of ordinary writing, whatever its national context, was the presence within it of oral speech and dialectal forms. They used dialect for many different reasons. Sometimes it was a source of humor. At others, it was an expression of local solidarity with one's readers. Sometimes it just came naturally when the writer was mentally struggling to translate from a local into a national language on the paper. Leo Spitzer, who was an Austrian censor in the First World War, reading the correspondence of Italian prisoners of war in Austria, decided that the letter doesn't give a picture of dialect, but rather of a struggle between dialect and the written word. But the common writer is not just close to the world of oral communication, but also part of a culture which embraces gesture and symbol. Letters by common writers don't always show a mastery of blank spaces on the page. In fact, they may try to cover every millimeter with writing, saturating all the graphic space available. But they nevertheless have a keen sense of the theater of letter writing, and gestures of love, deference, or obedience are inherent in the letters they wrote home. This is best illustrated by the so-called bowing letters of Polish emigrants writing home from North and South America. Their greetings were highly ritualized, and as they wrote, they imagined arriving home after a long absence. Thus, I quote, "We step across your threshold and we greet you and we kiss your hand and feet." And after this, the writer would perform a ritual of bowing to absent members of the family. So the letter home was not just an intermingling of writing and the spoken word, it was also a ceremonial act with multiple dimensions. And the correspondence of ordinary writings, of ordinary writers, I should say, tends to be formulaic. So often do they repeat themselves that one ambitious language specialist has reduced their common structure to 7 key elements. First, the salutatio, the formal greeting, to be followed in every letter from an emigrant or a soldier by 2 important steps. Firstly, a report on letters sent and received, the confirmatio receptionis, or alternatively, the expression of anxiety because some letters had not been received. And secondly, a reassuring discourse about the writer's health, the dissertatio valitudinis. All this was the prelude to the body of the letter, containing whatever news the writer wished to relate, the narratio, and this might be combined with a simple request, as when soldiers asked for a food parcel or warmer clothing. Then came the nuntiatio parentum, in which the writer farewelled a number of family members, addressing them all carefully in turn and in order of seniority, obeying an important ritual aiming to resituate the writer within the social network from which he or she was temporarily or permanently absent. And the farewell, of course, closed this highly structured sequence. In such letters, the narration, or the argument of the letter, might take up a very small part of the whole, whereas discussions of health and of mail either received or on the way, together with the long list of relatives acknowledged by the writer, consumed the overwhelming bulk of the text. In the past, this has dismayed some editors of letter collections who decided to delete the long opening and closing sections of correspondence for publication. In so doing, they were actually eliminating parts of the text which were of high importance to the letter writer. And one last characteristic before I finish of ordinary writing, I should add, is its inherent gender bias. Although the preponderance of male writers is perhaps not as dominant as might be assumed from my previous comments about soldiers' letters, actually letters from the front can be supplemented by letters to the front from wives, lovers, and mothers. In addition, we do have letters from the period of the First World War from women who were forcibly evacuated from the war zones, so that the epistolary landscape of war is not exclusively masculine. More variety is found in letters of emigration. Laura Martinez estimates that about 60% of emigrants' letters from America were written by men. A precise gender breakdown, however, is problematic, since many letters did not have a single author, but were collectively drafted by different family members. The male majority in letter writing, in any letter writing corpus, perpetuates an imbalance which probably goes back to the beginnings of written communication. It reflects the historically dominant role of men in politics, business, and administration, as well as the more widespread distribution of writing literacy skills among men compared to women. So to conclude, the study of historical literacy no longer focuses, as it once did, on statistical studies based on who could sign a marriage register and who could not. Instead, it probes access to reading and writing and the uses to which literate people put their skills. In considering the uses and the functions of writing in different historical contexts, we must henceforth include writers who lacked formal education and who did not enjoy a full mastery of literacy skills. We question the pervasive assumption that the lower classes, the poorly educated, the peu lettrés, the analfabetizados, have left little trace of their existence because they never mastered the pen or the pencil. Their allegedly poor level of literacy competence has sometimes been offered as an excuse for the marginalization of the illiterate or semi-literate in dominant historical narratives. But I would argue that it is time to include their writing, and that in order to interpret it, a flexible disciplinary matrix is required. Gracias por vuestra atención.